Story 1. The Mirror in Room 6. The inn sat on the outskirts of town, a place travelers often overlooked in favor of shinier hotels closer to the highway. Its wooden sign creaked on rusty chains, and the paint had long since faded to the color of ash. I stopped there only because the rain had grown too heavy to continue driving. The woman at the front desk slid me a key attached to a tarnished brass tag with the number 6 engraved on it. She didn't smile, and she didn't look me in the eye, just told me in a low voice that the room was upstairs at the end of the hall. Room 6 was small and plain, but clean enough. A single bed with a heavy quilt, a lamp whose yellow bulb buzzed faintly, and a dresser with an oval mirror framed in dark wood. The mirror stood out in the otherwise bare room, tall enough to show me from head to toe. I dropped my bag and sat on the bed, relieved to be dry, but the relief was short-lived. Out of the corner of my eye, something about the reflection caught me. The quilt behind me in the mirror seemed darker, almost red, as though it were stained. When I turned around, it was its normal dull gray. I told myself it was the light and tried to ignore it. But as night fell, the mirror demanded my attention. I could see the faint outline of a figure in the reflection, a woman standing in the far corner of the room. Her head was bowed, her long hair hiding her face, her hands clasped in front of her as though in prayer. I spun around quickly. The corner was empty. When I looked back, she was still there in the mirror, closer now, her hair shifting slightly as though stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. My breath quickened. I backed away from the glass, but the reflection kept changing. The woman raised her head, and I saw her eyes, dark hollows that seemed to drink in all the light of the room. She lifted her hand and pressed it to the inside of the glass. A smear trailed down as though her skin were wet. I bolted for the bed, refusing to look, but I could feel her watching me through the night. When morning finally came, the mirror looked ordinary again. I hurried downstairs and tossed the key onto the counter, muttering something about an early departure. The woman at the desk didn't look surprised. She just nodded slowly, her eyes flicking to the stairs as though she already knew. Then, in that same low voice, she said, "No one ever lasts more than a night in room 6. Story 2. The door that wouldn't stay shut. The hotel was the kind of place people only found when they were desperate. I had driven for hours through winding country roads until the gas light on my car glared red. A single neon sign appeared in the distance, flickering the word vacancy. I pulled in without hesitation. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and lemon cleaner, an odd mixture that clung to the air. The man at the front desk handed me a key without small talk. His expression was weary, and his hands trembled as he slid the ledger toward me for a signature. The key bore the number 11. Room 11 was plain, with beige walls, a single bed, and a window looking out onto the gravel parking lot. The only thing out of place was the door to the adjoining room. It was locked from my side, the knob cold and stiff when I tried it. I didn't think much of it and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a click. My eyes snapped open, and in the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, I saw the adjoining door standing slightly ajar. Just a sliver, enough to reveal darkness on the other side. I was certain I had locked it earlier. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the thin carpet, and pushed it shut until the latch clicked back into place. My fingers lingered on the knob, icy against my skin, before I turned back to bed. Not long after, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a latch slipping free, followed by a slow, deliberate creak. The door was open once more. The strip of darkness yawned wider this time, and I thought I heard breathing from the other side, steady and low. I shut it again, jamming the chain lock across my main door for good measure, then shoved the desk chair against the adjoining one. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing silently in the gap. At 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the chair scraping across the floor. My heart thundered as I sat up. The adjoining door was wide open now, the chair pushed aside, and the room beyond was nothing but blackness. Not shadows, not darkness as I knew it, just an empty, swallowing void. I grabbed my bag without thinking and ran out into the night, the cool air biting against my sweat-soaked skin. When I slammed the front door of the hotel behind me, I saw the desk clerk still sitting there. He didn't look surprised. He just muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "That door never stays shut." I drove off with the gas light still on, choosing the empty road over the comfort of a bed, because anything was safer than that open door. Story 3. The Voice in the Vents. The motel looked as though it had been forgotten by time. Its sign buzzed with a faint electric hum, half the letters burned out, leaving only the word MOT. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, the asphalt glistening from a recent rain. I was too tired to keep driving, so I pulled in, telling myself one night wouldn't hurt. The clerk barely looked up when I asked for a room. He slid me a key for number 7 and muttered something I couldn't catch, his voice hoarse as though he hadn't spoken in days. The hallway leading to my room smelled faintly of bleach and damp carpet, a sour mix that clung to the back of my throat. Room 7 was small and worn, the kind of place where the wallpaper peeled at the seams and the lampshade leaned awkwardly to one side. The radiator hissed in bursts, filling the silence with a low metallic groan. I dropped my bag and tried to convince myself it was fine for just a single night. But then I heard it, so faint I almost missed it. A whisper, threading through the air vents above the bed. At first it was only a breath, a gentle exhale, like someone trying to get my attention without words. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the cool metal grate. The sound became clearer. A voice, low and deliberate, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I stumbled back, trying to laugh it off. Old motels always had their quirks. Pipes clanged, vents carried noise, walls were thin. But as the hours dragged by, the voice returned again and again. Sometimes it was soft, like a lullaby. Other times harsh, urgent, almost pleading. Each time I pressed my hand to the vent, the cold metal vibrated faintly beneath my palm, as though someone were just on the other side, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my name. Clear this time. Whispered through the vent with deliberate care, syllable by syllable. My blood ran cold. I sat frozen in bed, my heart hammering so loud I thought it would drown out everything else. The voice repeated it again, more insistent now. I dragged the desk chair beneath the vent and climbed up, hands trembling as I unscrewed the rusty grate. The air that spilled out was icy, sharp enough to sting my skin. The shaft stretched into darkness, deeper than it should have for such a small building. And from within that black corridor, I heard faint scratching, like nails on metal, coming closer. I dropped the grate, scrambling back, and shoved the dresser against the wall to cover the vent. But even then, I could still hear it, muffled but steady, the voice whispering, always whispering, my name drawn out until it no longer sounded human. At dawn, I left the room key on the counter without a word. The clerk glanced at me, his eyes sunken and shadowed, and said, "You heard it too, didn't you?" His tone carried no surprise. Only resignation. I didn't answer. I just walked out into the gray morning, the echo of that whisper still threading through my ears, as though it had followed me out into the world. Story 4. the window at the end of the hall. The hotel was an old brick building tucked away on a forgotten side street. Its windows were narrow and dusty, the curtains inside drawn tight as if to keep something out, or in. I checked in late, just before midnight, when the streets were empty and silent except for the occasional rustle of trash drifting in the wind. The receptionist gave me a room key with barely a glance, her fingers trembling as she slid it across the counter. My room was on the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with identical doors, each marked with tarnished brass numbers. The carpet was threadbare in places, stained with dark shapes that told stories I didn't want to imagine. At the very end of the corridor, past my room, was a single tall window. It looked strange even from a distance, too clean, too clear compared to the filth of the rest of the building. I unlocked my door, tossed my bag inside, and tried not to think about it. But every time I stepped out into the hall, my eyes were drawn to that window. It faced an alley where no light should have reached, yet it glowed faintly, as though lit from behind. The glass shimmered with a subtle ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. That night, unable to sleep, I opened my door and looked down the hall. The window was glowing again, brighter now, casting pale silver light onto the faded carpet. I told myself it was a trick of the moon, even though I knew the alley faced the opposite direction. I walked closer, each step muffled by the carpet's worn threads. The air grew colder, sharper, filling my lungs with a chill that stung. As I drew nearer, I saw movement behind the glass. Shadows flickered, human in shape but distorted, stretching and twisting as if they belonged to people who weren't quite people anymore. My heart pounded. I leaned in, pressing my hand to the cold surface. For a moment, the glass gave beneath my touch, pliant like skin. And then a hand pressed back from the other side. Pale. Thin. Fingers long and bony, leaving streaks of condensation across the pane. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the uneven carpet. The hand lingered, sliding slowly across the inside of the glass, tracing invisible lines that looked like letters, though I couldn't make them out. Behind it, more faces appeared, dozens of them, mouths moving silently, eyes wide and hollow. I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut, heart hammering in my chest. But even through the wood, I could see the pale glow spilling in from the hall, seeping through the cracks as though the light itself were alive. At dawn, when I finally dared to leave, the window was dull and ordinary, streaked with dirt like all the others. But when I walked past, I caught my reflection in the glass. Only it wasn't me. The face staring back had hollow eyes and lips that moved soundlessly, just like the figures I had seen inside the night before. I turned away and never looked back. Story 5. The Room with the Red Carpet. The hotel was far from anything familiar, tucked along a desolate stretch of highway where the field stretched out into endless black. I had been driving for hours, my eyes gritty with exhaustion, when I saw the flickering neon sign that simply read rooms. There were no other cars in the lot when I pulled in, only the sound of crickets rising and falling like a restless tide. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the single lamp casting yellow shadows that crawled across the walls. The man at the desk looked startled to see me, as though guests were a rare occurrence. He hesitated before handing me the key, his lips twitching as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. The tag read Room 19. The hallway smelled of dust and old wood. The carpet was faded and threadbare in most places, except for Room 19. The moment I opened the door, I saw it, a lush, deep red carpet covering the floor from wall to wall, plush underfoot like thick velvet. It looked new, impossibly new, compared to the decay everywhere else in the building. The rest of the room was plain. A bed, a dresser, a cracked lampshade. But that carpet caught my eye every time. Its color was too rich, too dark, and when I touched it, the fibers seemed to cling to my skin, as though reluctant to let go. The smell in the room was faintly metallic, sharp at the back of my throat, though I couldn't find a source. That night, I woke to a sensation I couldn't explain. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, and the room was silent, too silent. Then I heard it, a muffled sound, soft and wet, like something moving beneath the floor. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, as though something were shifting just below the surface of the carpet. I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush red fibers. For a moment, it felt warm, too warm, as though the carpet were alive, pulsing faintly against my skin. My stomach twisted, and I leapt back onto the bed, heart racing. The muffled sounds grew clearer now, rhythmic, almost like breathing. I stared at the carpet, and in the dim glow of the lamp, I thought I saw the fibers moving, swaying gently as though stirred by an unseen current. Then, slowly, a dark stain began to spread from the center, seeping outward. It was thick and glistening, darker than the carpet itself, and the metallic smell filled the room so strongly I gagged. I scrambled for my shoes and bag, never taking my eyes off the floor. The stain continued to spread, reaching toward the bed, the fibers of the carpet glistening wet in the low light. As I bolted for the door, I swore I saw the faint outline of a hand pressing upward from beneath the surface, its fingers straining against the fabric. I didn't wait to see more. I ran down the hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the lobby, the man at the desk looked up with tired, hollow eyes. Before I could speak, he said quietly, "You stayed in 19, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I just left, the image of that living, breathing carpet burned into my mind. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel its warmth clinging to the soles of my feet. Story 6, the elevator that never stopped. The hotel was tall and narrow, squeezed between two office buildings in the middle of the city. From the outside it looked ordinary, with mirrored glass windows that reflected the street below. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble, though the place felt strangely empty for its size. The clerk gave me my key quickly, avoiding eye contact, and pointed me toward the elevator at the far end of the hall. The elevator was an old one, with brass doors dulled by fingerprints and a panel of buttons that clicked loudly when pressed. I stepped inside, the air heavy with the faint scent of oil and dust. The light overhead flickered slightly as I pressed the button for the 7th floor. The ride was smooth at first, the cables humming softly. But then the elevator didn't stop. The panel dinged as we passed the 7th floor, then the 8th, then the 9th. My stomach tightened. I pressed the button again, harder this time, then jabbed at lobby. The buttons lit up beneath my fingers but did nothing. The numbers climbed higher than the building should have had, 10th, 11th, 12th. My heart pounded as I realized I had only seen 9 floors from the street. Yet the numbers kept ticking upward, each chime echoing hollow in the small metal box. The air grew colder, the light overhead dimming until the corners of the elevator filled with shadows. I hit the emergency stop. The elevator shuddered but did not slow. My reflection in the brass doors looked strange now, darker, distorted, as though I were staring at a version of myself with hollow eyes. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching the railing as the count passed 20, then 30, the chimes sounding slower now, deeper, like a tolling bell. Finally, the elevator jerked to a stop. The doors slid open to reveal a hallway bathed in gray light. The carpet was worn and damp, the wallpaper sagging as though soaked through with water. The air smelled of rot and mildew. Every door lining the hall was open just a crack, and from within came faint whispers, rising and falling like the sound of 100 voices murmuring secrets at once. I didn't step out. I couldn't. Something about the hallway felt wrong, stretched too long, receding into a vanishing point that seemed endless. I slammed the closed door button, my hands slick with sweat, and after what felt like an eternity the doors creaked shut. The elevator began to descend, numbers ticking backwards slowly. But the ride down was worse. The whispers didn't fade, they grew louder, pressing against the walls of the elevator until they felt like they were inside my skull. By the time the doors finally opened into the lobby, my legs were trembling so badly I nearly collapsed stepping out. The clerk looked up at me as though expecting my return. His voice was flat when he said, "You didn't get out, did you?" I shook my head, too shaken to speak. He gave the faintest of nods and added, "Never step off. No matter what floor it shows you." I left the hotel that night without even going to my room, and I never set foot in an elevator again without a chill crawling up my spine. Story 7. The Guest Who Wasn't There. The inn was small, the kind of roadside stop that looked almost cozy at first glance. Its porch light glowed faintly in the mist, and the wooden sign swung gently in the night air. I was the only car in the gravel lot, and when I stepped inside, the front desk was unattended. A bell sat on the counter, and when I rang it, a man emerged from a back office, his expression blank but polite. He gave me a room on the second floor, number 12. The hallway was quiet, lined with faded photographs of landscapes long forgotten. My footsteps echoed softly on the thin carpet as I made my way to the room. Across from my door, another room stood open. Inside, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a man sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, his head bent low. I thought nothing of it, assuming another guest had checked in before me. My room was simple, though clean. A bed with a quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window looking out onto the fog-drenched road. I unpacked a little, then lay down, listening to the quiet hum of the night. That's when I heard it, the sound of movement from the room across the hall. Footsteps pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate. Hours passed, and still the footsteps continued. Back and forth, back and forth. I pressed my ear to the wall, the sound vibrating faintly through the plaster. Sometimes it stopped entirely, only to resume moments later. When I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I dreamed of someone walking just beyond my door, never pausing, never resting. At dawn, I woke groggy and unsettled. My eyes drifted to the door across the hall. It stood open just as it had the night before. Curiosity overcame me. I stepped out and looked inside. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, the quilt neatly folded, the air stale as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. A thick layer of dust coated the dresser and the window ledge, and when I stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath my weight. There were no footprints. No sign that anyone had stayed there. Confused, I went downstairs to return my key. The man at the desk looked up slowly, his expression heavy with something that seemed almost like pity. I asked casually about the room across from mine. "No one stays there," he said flatly. "Hasn't been rented in decades." I wanted to press him further, but his eyes told me the conversation was over. I left the inn with the sound of those footsteps still echoing in my mind, measured, deliberate, endless. And even now, in the quiet of night, I sometimes hear them pacing just outside my door. Story 8. The check-in that never happened. I had been driving for most of the day when I saw the hotel rising out of the fog, its tall, narrow windows lit with a dim orange glow. The building looked oddly elegant compared to the empty stretch of highway around it, almost too grand for its location. I pulled in, grateful for a place to rest, and stepped inside. The lobby was richly decorated, though everything seemed a little faded, as if it had once been glorious but had long since lost its shine. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dulled by dust. A fire burned in the hearth, though no warmth reached me as I approached the desk. The clerk was a thin man in a black suit, his hair slicked neatly back, his face pale. He smiled politely when I asked for a room, slid a pen toward me, and I signed the guest book. The key he handed me was heavy, brass, with the number 4 etched deep into its surface. Room 4 was upstairs, at the end of a long carpeted hall. Inside, it was lavish compared to most roadside hotels, thick drapes, ornate wallpaper, and a bed with carved wooden posts. I settled in quickly, relieved to be somewhere that felt safe. That night, however, I was woken by the sound of voices in the hallway. Muffled at first, then clearer, as though people were standing just outside my door. I cracked it open, peering out into the dim light. The hall was empty, but the voices persisted, drifting like smoke from nowhere. I closed the door, unease settling in my stomach. My eyes drifted to the dresser, where the guest book sat. I hadn't noticed it before. Flipping it open, I found page after page of names scrawled in faded ink. Mine was at the very bottom, fresh and dark. But when I traced the date at the top of the page, my blood ran cold. The last recorded entry was nearly 50 years ago. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. The voices outside grew louder, overlapping, whispers and laughter and sighs all blending into a rising chorus. I clutched the brass key, its metal hot against my palm now, and shoved it into the lock, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle turned uselessly, as though the mechanism had vanished. The voices pressed closer, filling the room with their echo until it felt like the air itself vibrated. I stumbled back, my eyes darting to the window, but the heavy drapes refused to move no matter how hard I pulled. The fire in the lobby below crackled faintly, though no smoke rose, no warmth reached me, only the sound. At dawn, I found myself lying fully clothed on the bed, the key still clutched in my hand. The room was silent again, the guest book gone. I ran downstairs, ready to demand answers, but the desk was empty. The hearth was cold, filled with long-dead ashes. The chandelier hung dark and lifeless. There was no one there. No staff, no guests, no sign the place had been occupied in decades. My name was still the last one written in the dusty guest ledger on the counter, the ink faded now, as though it had been written long ago. I didn't look back as I left, but sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear the faint murmur of voices just outside my door, waiting, patient, as though I never really checked out. Story 9, The Portrait in Room 22. The hotel stood on a lonely stretch of countryside road, its roofline sharp against the dusk sky. It had once been a manor, or so the desk clerk told me as he slid the heavy brass key across the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long, as if weighing whether or not to say more. The tag read Room 22. The walk up the staircase was quiet, my footsteps muffled by the thick, dust-caked carpet. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, though there were no vents, no open windows. When I reached the second floor, the hallway stretched long and dim, lit by a single flickering bulb. Room 22 waited at the very end. The room was spacious, more so than I expected, with high ceilings and ornate molding. Heavy curtains sealed off the window, their fabric stiff with age. But it wasn't the bed, the dresser, or the musty smell of mothballs that caught my attention. It was the portrait above the headboard. A woman stared out from the canvas, her features sharp, her dark eyes following me no matter where I stood. The paint was cracked, the colors dulled, yet her gaze felt piercingly alive. I tried to ignore it as I unpacked, but every time I glanced up, she seemed closer, her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smirk. That night, I lay in bed, the silence of the room pressing down like a weight. The curtains rustled faintly, though no breeze stirred. My eyes drifted up toward the portrait. The woman's face was different now. Her head was tilted slightly, her smirk wider, revealing the glint of teeth. I sat up, my chest tight, my skin prickling. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, but when I blinked, she shifted again. Her painted hands were no longer folded in her lap. They were pressed against the frame, fingers splayed, as though she were leaning forward, ready to step out. I scrambled for the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. But the knob was stiff, unmoving beneath my frantic grip. A sound filled the room then, a faint scratching, like nails dragging along canvas. I turned slowly, dread curdling in my stomach. The woman's hands were halfway through the frame now, pale and long, her painted skin glistening as though wet with fresh oil. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she smiled. I shoved my shoulder against the door with all my strength until it finally gave way, the wood splintering beneath me. I bolted down the hall, not daring to look back. When I returned in the morning with the clerk to retrieve my things, the portrait hung as it had before, the woman seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression placid. Only one detail was different. On the painted floor at her feet, nearly hidden in shadow, was the faint outline of a figure curled on the ground. A figure wearing my clothes. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back, and I've never gone near that countryside road again. Story 10, The Elevator That Shouldn't Exist. The building was old, the kind of hotel that still carried the echoes of another century. Marble floors, brass railings, and ceilings painted with faded murals of angels that no longer looked kind. I was only there for one night, traveling through the city, and the front desk clerk handed me a key with a polite smile that didn't touch his eyes. My room was on the 5th floor. I stepped into the elevator, its doors heavy and ornate, the kind that clanged shut with finality. Inside, the panel was strange. It had buttons for floors 1 through 6, but there was another as well, worn down, the number rubbed away. I pressed 5, and the elevator creaked upward. The cables groaned, the light overhead flickered. Then the lift shuddered to a halt. When the doors opened, it wasn't the 5th floor. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in strips, the carpet stained and damp. There was no sign, no number, nothing to suggest I was on any recognized floor of the hotel. Against my better judgment, I stepped out. The silence was absolute. No humming pipes, no distant voices, just the faint buzzing of a light that swung on a loose wire. Doors lined the hallway, each one closed, though as I passed, I thought I heard faint whispers leaking from behind them. Some low, some high, voices overlapping in a way that made no sense. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed one door ajar. The number was scratched out, the wood warped with age. I pushed it open, the hinges screeching, and found a room that was empty. Completely bare. No bed, no furniture, not even dust. Just smooth, cold floors and walls that seemed to press inward the longer I stared. Then the door slammed shut behind me. The room grew darker, the air colder. A sound rose up from the floor itself, a low thrum, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I pressed against the door, but it wouldn't move. The shadows along the walls began to stretch, curling upward like fingers reaching for me. I backed into the corner, my throat tight, and whispered to myself that it wasn't real. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and close, whispering my name directly into my ear. The door burst open, light spilling in from the hallway, and I stumbled out, gasping, my whole body trembling. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced once more by silence. I ran back to the elevator, slamming the button for the lobby. The doors closed, the lift groaned, and this time it carried me smoothly down. When I stepped out, the clerk looked up from the desk as though nothing was wrong. Breathless, I asked him about the unmarked button in the elevator. His face went pale. He leaned forward and said quietly, "There is no unmarked button. There never has been." Later that night, in my room, I woke to the faint sound of the elevator bell. Ding. Slow, deliberate. It stopped on my floor, though no one had called it. I never opened the door to check, but I swear I heard the whisper of footsteps outside, pausing at my room before moving on. I checked out before dawn, leaving the key on the counter without a word. Story 11. The room service knock. I had been on the road for days, weary from endless flights and long layovers, so when I finally checked into the old city hotel, all I wanted was silence and rest. The building had a faded grandeur to it, tall columns in the lobby, chandeliers that swayed faintly when the air conditioning kicked in, and bellhops who moved with eerie quietness, as though trained not to disturb the atmosphere. My room was on the 7th floor, tucked into the farthest corner of the hallway. The carpet there smelled faintly of mold, and the wallpaper had dark stains that no one had bothered to scrub away. I told myself I was imagining the odd weight in the air, like the whole place had been waiting for me. Around midnight, after I had showered and collapsed into bed, I heard a knock. 3 soft taps on the door. I froze. I hadn't ordered room service, and it was far too late for housekeeping. Another knock followed, slightly louder this time, insistent, measured. "Who is it?" I called, my voice tight. Silence. I approached the door, pressing my eye to the peephole, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out with its flickering yellow lights. My hand hovered over the chain lock. I almost unlatched it, thinking maybe it was a prank, when the knock came again, closer this time, lower, like knuckles dragging across the wood. I stepped back, my skin prickling. Then a voice came through the door, faint but clear. "Room service." The tone was flat, drained of life, like someone repeating a phrase they didn't understand. "I didn't order anything," I stammered. The voice paused, then repeated in the exact same tone, the exact same pitch, "Room service." I dialed the front desk, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The clerk answered, groggy. I told him someone was at my door, claiming to be room service. There was a pause on the line before he said, "Sir, we don't offer room service at night. Our kitchen closes at 10. The blood drained from my face. I whispered that someone was standing outside right now, knocking. The clerk's voice dropped lower. "Stay away from the door. We're sending someone up." I clutched the phone like a lifeline, but then came the sound I'll never forget, the doorknob slowly turning, the metal scraping softly, as though someone was testing it from the other side. The chain rattled against the pressure, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The clerk was still on the line, asking if I was safe, when the pressure on the door stopped. Silence again. I crept to the peephole once more. Nothing. The hallway was deserted. Minutes later, a security guard arrived, pounding on the door with authority. I let him in, trembling, and he searched the hall. There was no one. He told me it was probably some drunk guest who got the wrong room. I wanted to believe him. But just before he left, he frowned at the inside of my door. There, etched faintly into the wood at eye level, were 4 long scratches. Fresh, deep, and unmistakable, as though someone had dragged their nails across it while knocking. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I checked out. The front desk clerk avoided my eyes when I asked him if this had happened before. He only muttered, "That room gets complaints." I never stayed in that city again. Story 12. The woman at the end of the hall. The hotel was one of those that seemed frozen in time, velvet drapes heavy with dust, chandeliers dimmed by years of neglect, and long corridors lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow you wherever you walked. I had chosen it only because it was cheap, and I told myself I could tolerate one night of discomfort before moving on. My room was on the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the carpet a deep red that muffled my footsteps. The air was unnervingly still, thick with the stale scent of mothballs and polish. As I reached my door, fumbling with the key, I glanced down the length of the hallway. She was standing there. A woman in a long, old-fashioned dress, cream-colored but yellowed with age. Her hair was dark, pinned tightly at the back of her head, and she stood perfectly still at the far end of the corridor. Too still. Her face was turned away from me, angled toward the wall. I froze, the key halfway into the lock. "Hello?" I called nervously, my voice echoing down the hall. She didn't move. Trying to shake the unease, I forced myself into my room, telling myself she was just another guest. But when I closed the door, I couldn't shake the image of her stillness, her unnatural posture. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, the kind that pressed into the carpet hard enough for the floorboards beneath to creak faintly. I sat upright, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped outside my room. I gathered enough courage to peek through the peephole. She was there. Standing directly in front of my door now. Her head tilted slightly upward, as though listening. Even through the tiny glass lens, I could see that her face was wrong, too pale, too smooth, her eyes hollow and sunken, fixed on nothing. I stumbled back from the door, heart hammering. A whisper seeped through the crack at the bottom, soft, drawn out, a single word I couldn't make out. Then the handle rattled. Slowly, gently, like she was testing it. I pressed myself against the opposite wall, every muscle locked in terror. The rattling stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Minutes dragged on like hours. When I finally forced myself to look through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. At dawn, when I opened the door, there was no sign of her. No footprints, no trace. But on the carpet, pressed faintly into the fibers just outside my room, was the outline of a single shoe. Small. Delicate. Facing inward, toward my door. I checked out without breakfast, ignoring the desk clerk's puzzled glance. As I left, I glanced once more down the 3rd floor hallway. For a moment, I thought I saw her again, standing motionless at the far end, her face turned toward the wall. Story 13. The phone that rang at midnight. I was staying at a mid-range hotel on the outskirts of a small city. It wasn't grand or historic, just a place for business travelers passing through, the kind with beige walls, patterned carpets, and vending machines humming softly in the corners. Nothing about it should have felt strange. Yet from the moment I entered my room, I felt unsettled. The air carried a faint metallic tang, and the silence pressed down on me as though the walls were holding their breath. The room had a landline phone on the nightstand, an old corded model with yellowing buttons. I didn't think much of it until it rang. It was exactly midnight. The sound jolted me upright in bed, the shrill tone slicing through the silence. I stared at it, my pulse racing. No one should be calling. Still, after the second ring, I answered. Hello. There was nothing. Just static at first, crackling like distant thunder. Then, faintly, a voice. It was so soft I had to press the receiver hard against my ear. It whispered my name. Not once, but over and over, in a rasp that made my skin crawl. I slammed the phone down, my hand trembling, and sat frozen, staring at it. The silence returned. I tried to convince myself it was some crossed line, an error. I crawled back under the covers, my body tense, every sound magnified by my racing heartbeat. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. I let it ring, the sound drilling into my skull, each shrill chime sharper than the last. After what felt like forever, it stopped. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, only for the silence to be shattered once more as it rang a third time. I unplugged it, yanked the cord from the wall with shaking hands and shoved the phone into the drawer. Finally, I managed to lie back down, the adrenaline fading enough for exhaustion to pull me under. But when I woke up in the early morning light, the phone was back on the nightstand. Plugged in. Receiver neatly in place. I stared at it, my chest tight, bile rising in my throat. I hadn't touched it since stuffing it in the drawer. My bag was still zipped, my door locked from the inside. I dressed quickly and left, dropping the key at the front desk without a word. As I stepped outside, I felt the vibration of my cell phone in my pocket. I pulled it out, relief washing over me, until I saw the screen. Unknown number. Missed call. Time, exactly midnight. I never answered, and I never stayed in that hotel again. Story 14, The Room with No Reflection. On a business trip to a small industrial town, I checked into a hotel that looked ordinary from the outside. Plain brick, neon sign flickering, automatic doors that hissed when you entered. Inside, the decor was dated, fake plants gathering dust, dull gold trim, and mirrors everywhere, as though the management thought endless reflections would disguise the age of the place. My room was on the 4th floor. It was small but neat, with a bed pressed against one wall and a long mirror directly across from it. The mirror was large, mounted floor to ceiling, its surface slightly warped, giving reflections of faintly wavy quality. I remember thinking it made the room feel even smaller. After settling in, I went to wash up. The bathroom mirror reflected me normally, but when I stepped back into the main room and glanced at the big mirror, I froze. I wasn't in it. The bed was there. The lamp. The curtains drawn tight. But where I should have been standing, there was nothing. Just the empty room staring back at me. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled forward, waving my arm, jumping side to side. Still nothing. My reflection simply wasn't there. Yet the rest of the room reflected perfectly. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the warped glass playing with angles. But then I saw movement in the mirror. Not me, someone else. A shadow, faint at first, like a smudge that darkened and sharpened as I watched. It was tall, broad-shouldered, with no face, just a hollow absence where features should have been. The figure stood at the foot of my bed in the reflection. I whipped my head toward the bed. Nothing. Empty. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now. My breath came shallow, ragged. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I spent the night in the lobby, ignoring the clerk's raised eyebrows, too terrified to explain. The next morning, I forced myself to return to gather my things. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the room with warmth that felt almost normal. I dared to glance at the mirror again. There I was, my reflection, exactly where it should have been. Relief almost made me laugh. Almost. Until I noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the inside of the glass, pressed against the surface from the other side. The fingers were long, the palm broad. Too big to be mine. I left without checking out. Story 15, The Footsteps on the Ceiling. I was driving through the countryside late one evening when fatigue forced me to stop at a roadside inn. The building was small and squat, with only 2 floors, its paint peeling in strips under the weak glow of the parking lot lights. The clerk barely looked up as he slid the key toward me, his expression unreadable. My room was on the ground floor. It was modest, 2 lamps, a sagging mattress, curtains that didn't quite close. Exhaustion numbed me, and I fell into bed without even turning on the television. For a while, I slept soundly. Then, sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they moved across the ceiling above me. Heel, toe. Heel, toe. I groaned, thinking another guest had arrived in the room upstairs. But the clerk had said the entire second floor was closed for renovation. I tried to ignore it. But the steps grew louder, more distinct, pacing back and forth directly above my bed. My heart started to pound. The ceiling creaked as though under real weight, dust sprinkling down with each heavy step. Summoning courage, I went outside to check. From the parking lot, I looked up. The windows above my room were boarded over, plywood nailed tight. There was no light, no way anyone could be staying up there. Yet even from outside, I could hear it, the faint thud of footsteps moving across the roofline. I hurried back into my room, trying to convince myself it was raccoons, maybe stray animals. I crawled back under the covers, pulling them over my head like a child. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in heavy, and just when I began to relax, there came a new sound, directly above me. Scraping. As if long nails were dragging slowly across the ceiling, tracing the outline of my bed. My chest went tight, panic flooding every vein. Then, impossibly, the footsteps resumed, but this time, not on the ceiling. They were on the wall. I could hear them moving sideways, down from the ceiling to the wall above the headboard. Thud. Thud. The plaster vibrated with each step. My breath caught as they reached the floor, stopping just inches from where I lay. I didn't look. I didn't move. I stayed frozen under the covers until the first pale light of dawn seeped through the curtains. When I finally dared to sit up, the room was quiet again. But on the wall above my bed, etched faintly into the paint, were a series of dusty, dark prints, like footprints. Except they weren't shaped like any human foot I'd ever seen. I left the key at the desk and drove away without breakfast, without looking back. Story 16, The Door at the End of the Corridor. I checked into a grand old hotel that had clearly seen better days. The lobby was wide and echoing, filled with antique furniture polished to a dull sheen, and chandeliers that swung faintly with each draft. The clerk, an older man with a voice like gravel, gave me a key to the 6th floor. He didn't smile, didn't even look me in the eye. Just slid the brass key across the counter and muttered, "Don't go wandering at night." The elevator groaned its way up, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway that seemed unnaturally long. The carpet runner stretched in a red line that disappeared into shadows, and every wall sconce flickered faintly as though struggling to stay lit. My room was near the middle, and I tried not to notice that the farther end of the corridor seemed darker than it should have been, as though the light didn't quite reach. That night, sometime around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of doors opening and closing. Softly at first, then louder. My stomach clenched as I sat up, straining to hear. It was rhythmic, one door clicking open, a pause, then another closing. Moving closer. Curiosity, or maybe dread, pushed me to the peephole. The corridor was empty, stretching silently in both directions. But as I stared, I noticed something strange. At the farthest end of the hall, the darkest part, there was a door. One I hadn't noticed before. It was tall, narrow, and painted black, so dark it almost blended into the shadows. And it was opening. Slowly, silently, it creaked wider. The darkness behind it seemed deeper than the hallway itself, like staring into a pit. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift inside, something pale, though the details blurred as if the shadows were hiding it on purpose. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the door slammed shut. The noise echoed down the corridor, rattling the frame of my own door. I stumbled back, heart hammering, whispering to myself that it had to be a dream. But the next morning, when I stepped out to check, the end of the corridor was blank. No black door. No frame. Just smooth wallpaper running the entire length of the hall. I asked the clerk about it when I checked out. He looked at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, then said flatly, "There is no door on the 6th floor." I didn't argue. I left, but I still wake some nights to the sound of doors opening and closing, and in my mind, I see that black door at the end of the corridor, waiting to open again. Story 17, The Guest Who Wouldn't Leave. I had been assigned to a small, boutique hotel on a work trip. The building was quaint, only 3 stories tall, with ivy creeping up its brick walls and dim lanterns that flickered on at dusk. The staff were polite but oddly reserved, speaking in low tones as though afraid of being overheard. My room was on the 2nd floor. It was comfortable enough, with a 4-poster bed, an ornate desk, and heavy curtains that smelled faintly of dust and smoke. Everything seemed fine until, late that night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of water running in the bathroom. I froze. I had been alone all evening. Slowly, I got up and pushed the door open. The sink faucet was running full force, water splashing into the basin. I turned it off, my hands shaking, and whispered to myself that it was just a plumbing issue. I climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Moments later, I felt the mattress dip beside me. The weight was subtle at first, like someone had just perched on the edge. My chest tightened as the sinking grew deeper, as though a body were lying down beside mine. I couldn't move. My skin prickled, and my breath caught in my throat. Summoning courage, I flicked on the bedside lamp. The other half of the bed was perfectly smooth, untouched. Yet the pressure remained, an invisible imprint pressed into the mattress, the sheets faintly wrinkled as though something were still there. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and backed into the corner of the room. That's when I noticed the closet door. It was open just a crack, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. From the darkness inside, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. I grabbed my bag and bolted, not bothering to close the door behind me. I spent the night in the lobby, too terrified to return. In the morning, the manager tried to reassure me, insisting it must have been stress or fatigue. But as I was leaving, he slipped and said, "That room always gets complaints about the guest who won't leave." Story 18, the phone that rang at midnight. The hotel was one of those business-style chains, modern, efficient, clean, but utterly soulless. Everything inside smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and artificial air freshener, a sterile tang that clung to the back of my throat. The halls were long and narrow, their cream-colored wallpaper bland, their fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. I had checked in late after a long day of travel, more eager for rest than anything else. My room was on the 8th floor, tucked at the end of the corridor where the hallway seemed unusually silent, as though the building's hum had been swallowed by something thicker, heavier. The room itself was unremarkable, a queen-sized bed, a desk with a bolted-down lamp, a generic framed print of some seaside landscape above the headboard. Everything was so normal it was almost oppressive. The first odd detail was the phone. It sat on the bedside table, one of those clunky black landline phones hotels still keep, its plastic slightly yellowed with age. I barely glanced at it when I first entered, tossing my bag on the bed and kicking off my shoes. I showered, brushed my teeth, and lay down with the TV flickering faintly in the background. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. I didn't even realize I had fallen asleep until the sound yanked me awake. The phone was ringing. Its shrill tone cut through the dark like a blade. I blinked, disoriented, staring at the red LED clock, exactly 12 a.m. My heart gave a startled jump. Who would be calling at midnight? I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the receiver. "Hello." My voice cracked from sleep. Silence. But not empty silence. I heard breathing. Slow. Even. Someone was on the other end, just listening. "Hello." I repeated, louder, my throat tightening. The breathing continued. My skin crawled. I slammed the receiver down, chest tight, telling myself it was a wrong number. Just a drunk guest dialing the wrong room. I lay back down, trying to steady my breath. The silence pressed in heavier than before, and just as I began to drift again, the phone rang. I bolted upright, the sound deafening in the darkness. My hands shook as I answered again. "Who is this?" I demanded, anger masking my fear. This time, there was a whisper. Faint, raspy, distorted as though carried through static. "Get out." My stomach flipped, cold nausea rising. I dropped the phone, the receiver swinging and clicking against the nightstand. For the next 10 minutes, I sat frozen, eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room, every creak of the building amplified. I forced myself to hang up the phone properly and unplug it from the wall. My heart pounded, a drumbeat against my ribs. Relief washed over me, until the phone rang again. Unplugged. Yet ringing. The sound was sharper now, echoing in the small room as though the walls themselves vibrated with it. I backed away until my shoulders pressed against the door. My pulse throbbed in my ears. The phone stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than the ringing. My ears rang in the absence of sound, and my breath came shallow and uneven. Then the receiver, still resting on its cradle, lifted. Slowly. By itself. It hovered for a second, then dropped back into place with a soft click. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag with shaking hands, nearly tripping over the strap, and fled the room. My bare feet slapped against the cold hallway carpet as I sprinted for the elevator, stabbing the button again and again until the doors opened. I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, too afraid to explain to the night clerk, who gave me a puzzled look as I sat in one of the stiff lobby chairs until dawn. When I finally checked out the next morning, I mentioned the midnight phone calls. The clerk's polite smile faltered. "That's strange," she said slowly. "That room doesn't even have an active line. The phones in those end units were disconnected months ago." I left without replying, but even now, years later, I can still hear the echo of that shrill ringing in the silence of my memory. Story 19, The Portrait That Watched Me. The hotel was one of those old establishments that clung to its faded prestige. Built more than a century ago, it had once hosted aristocrats, politicians, and wealthy travelers. Now it catered mostly to tourists who liked the idea of historic charm. The carpets were worn, the wallpaper bubbled with age, and the chandeliers drooped with dust. Still, it was cheap and near the train station, so I checked in. The clerk gave me a brass key with a leather tag and told me my room was on the second floor. The hallway was dim, lit by sconces that gave off more shadow than light, and the floor creaked with every step. I reached my room at the far end of the hall, unlocked the heavy door, and stepped inside. It was a large room, though shabby, tall ceilings, velvet curtains moth-eaten at the edges, and a bed with carved wooden posts. But the first thing I noticed was the painting on the wall opposite the bed. A massive portrait in a gilt frame. It was a woman. She wore a high-collar dress in muted tones, the fabric stiff with old-fashioned style. Her hair was pinned neatly, and her pale face was drawn in extraordinary detail. The brushstrokes were so fine they almost looked real. But what unsettled me most were her eyes. Dark, unblinking, and fixed forward. I tried to ignore it, setting down my bag and exploring the room. The bathroom door squeaked, the wardrobe smelled of cedar and dust, and the window overlooked a narrow alley littered with trash bins. But no matter where I moved, I felt her gaze on me. That night, after showering, I tried to settle into bed. The room was cold, the kind of chill that seeped through the walls. I turned off the lamp, pulling the blankets tight, but the portrait loomed across from me. Even in the darkness, I could still make out the pale oval of her face, the glint of her eyes. I rolled over, determined not to look, but sleep was impossible. At some point, I told myself to stop being ridiculous. I sat up and whispered into the darkness, "It's just a painting." But then I noticed something. The woman's face was different. Her head seemed tilted slightly downward, her gaze sharper, more direct. My throat tightened. I scrambled for the lamp, but when the light came on, the portrait looked the same as before. I tried to laugh it off, my voice thin and hollow, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I left the light on and forced my eyes shut. I must have dozed off, because I woke again sometime after midnight. The lamp had gone out. The bulb must have burned out. My heart sank as I blinked into the gloom. The portrait was darker now, its frame barely visible in the faint glow of moonlight leaking through the curtains. Yet her face was clearer than before. Pale. Too pale. And her mouth, had it been closed before? Now it was slightly parted, as though she were whispering something I couldn't hear. I sat up, my chest pounding. A floorboard creaked, not under me, but across the room. Near the wall where the painting hung. My eyes locked on it, too terrified to blink. The shadows seemed to ripple, and for a breathless moment, I thought I saw her hands, long, pale fingers, resting against the inside of the frame, as if she were pressing against the canvas itself. I grabbed my bag, heart hammering, and bolted for the door. I didn't bother to switch on the overhead light or look back. I ran barefoot down the hallway, the carpet rough under my soles, until I reached the lobby. The clerk was still there, dozing behind the desk. When he saw me, wild-eyed and trembling, he frowned. I stammered out what I had seen, voice cracking, and asked if anyone had ever complained about that room. He looked at me for a long time before replying quietly, "You shouldn't have stared at her. People always stare. That's when she notices." I checked out immediately, leaving the key on the counter. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched. In the shadows of my own bedroom, I swear I can see the faint outline of a gilt frame, and when I close my eyes, I hear the faintest whisper, like a woman's voice trying to call me back. Story 20. The elevator that skipped floors. The hotel was modern, sleek, and polished, quite the opposite of the old, crumbling inns I was used to when traveling for work. Its lobby gleamed with white marble floors, brushed steel accents, and mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. The elevators stood like polished chrome towers, their digital numbers glowing a cold blue. I was assigned a room on the 9th floor. After a long day, I stepped into the elevator with my suitcase, pressing the button for my floor. The doors slid shut smoothly, and the elevator began to rise. Soft music played, but I couldn't help noticing how quiet it felt inside, almost as though the sound was muffled, pressed in by unseen walls. The elevator passed the 2nd, 3rd, 4th floors. The numbers blinked in sequence. Then something strange happened. The panel lit up for the 7th floor, but instead of stopping, the elevator slowed almost to a halt, then jolted. The light flickered. The soft music warped, dragging for a second like a warped tape before snapping back into tune. My stomach dropped as the elevator suddenly descended instead of climbing. It bypassed the lobby entirely, rushing downward into a place that shouldn't exist. The panel numbers began to glow with floors that weren't part of the hotel. B2, B3, B4. My chest tightened. I hadn't pressed any of those. The elevator stopped abruptly, with a groan of cables. The doors slid open with a hiss, and I was confronted with darkness. A corridor stretched out before me, unlit except for the pale light spilling from the elevator. The floor was concrete, damp with puddles. The air that drifted and smelled of rot and mildew, as though the place hadn't been touched in decades. I jabbed the "close door" button, but the doors didn't move. They remained open, exposing that endless corridor. And then I heard it, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from somewhere in the blackness. I pressed every button on the panel. None responded. The lights flickered again, and the digital numbers scrambled, symbols and lines I didn't recognize flashing instead of floors. The footsteps grew louder, splashing faintly in the puddles. At last, the doors shuddered and slid closed. The elevator lurched violently upward, making my teeth rattle. I clutched the handrail, whispering frantically, "Please, please," as the numbers scrambled their way back to the familiar sequence. It finally stopped at the 9th floor. The doors opened to reveal the carpeted hallway, brightly lit and utterly normal. I stumbled out, half running to my room, and slammed the door shut behind me. Later, as I lay in bed, still shaking, I thought about what I'd seen in that underground corridor. Just before the doors closed, I could have sworn there was a figure standing at the far end. It didn't move, but its head tilted, as though it were watching me. The next morning, I asked the front desk if the hotel had basements. The clerk's polite smile faltered. "No, sir. Just the lobby and floors 1 through 12. I said nothing more, but when I checked out, I made sure to take the stairs. Story 21, The Room Without a Number. The hotel stood at the edge of a quiet city square, its brick facade aged but well kept, the kind of place that prided itself on heritage charm. I had booked a simple room for a week-long stay while attending a conference. From the moment I arrived, I noticed how attentive the staff were, smiling in that practiced way that never quite reached their eyes. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet, an oddly conflicting mix that clung to the air like stale perfume. My assigned room was on the 5th floor. As I walked down the hall with my suitcase wheels clattering against the thin carpet, I counted the doors: 507, 509, 511. The odd numbers lined one side, the even numbers opposite. Then, at the far end of the hall, there was a gap. A blank stretch of wall where a door should have been. My eyes lingered on it, unsettled by the symmetry broken so deliberately. That night, curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't help pacing the corridor, drawn again to that stretch of wall. I pressed my palm against it. It was cool, smoother than the plaster around it, almost as though it had been repainted more recently. I leaned in, ear brushing the surface, and I froze. I heard something, faint but distinct. The sound of someone breathing. Not a distant hum, not pipes. Breathing. My pulse quickened. I pressed harder, the wall chilling my skin. There was no mistake, slow, steady inhalations, like someone was standing inches away on the other side, waiting. I pulled back quickly, the hair on my arms stiffening. The next day, I asked a housekeeper about it casually while she replaced towels in my room. She stiffened immediately, then forced a smile. "That's just a wall, sir. Nothing there." But her hands shook slightly as she folded the washcloths, her eyes darting to the hallway. That evening, unable to resist, I returned. This time, the wall looked different. There was a faint outline, just visible if you looked at it directly, the faint seams of a doorframe. My throat tightened as I reached forward. My fingertips brushed what felt like the faint grooves of wood beneath a layer of paint. And then, as if responding to my touch, the outline became clearer, the frame swelling outward slightly. A doorknob appeared where none had been, a tarnished brass fixture that reflected the dim light. My legs wobbled as I stood frozen, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples. The knob turned. Slowly. By itself. The door cracked open with the groan of old hinges, and the air that spilled out was rank, damp earth, mold, and something coppery, metallic, sharp in the back of my throat. My eyes watered. I couldn't see anything inside, just blackness stretching in every direction, darker than it should have been, darker than a room could ever be. A whisper drifted out, faint but unmistakable. My name. Drawn out in a rasping breath. I stumbled back, tripping over my own suitcase, which I had dragged out of the room in my nervous pacing. The door shut with a slam, the frame vanishing instantly, leaving nothing but smooth wall again. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my things and left before dawn, the desk clerk raising his eyebrows as I shoved my key across the counter and muttered about an emergency. As I wheeled my bag through the lobby, I turned for one last look up at the 5th floor. In one of the windows, in the exact place where that wall should have been, I saw a figure. Standing still. Watching me. Story 22, The Portrait That Watched. The hotel was proud of its history. Every corner of the building reminded guests that it had stood for over a century, polished banisters worn smooth by countless hands, chandeliers that glowed with golden warmth but swayed ever so faintly even when the air was still, and long corridors lined with antique portraits of former owners, dignitaries, and local figures of importance. The walls practically breathed with memory, and though the staff called it heritage charm, there was something unsettling about being surrounded by so many painted eyes staring from every angle. My room was on the 3rd floor, near the end of one of those portrait-lined halls. The room itself was pleasant enough: high ceilings, heavy velvet curtains, a desk with brass fixtures, and a bed dressed in crisp linens that smelled faintly of lavender detergent. But dominating the space above the fireplace was a massive oil painting of a man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his posture rigid. His eyes, painted in meticulous detail, were the kind of eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you moved. They were a deep brown, almost black, and the longer I stared at them, the more uncomfortable I felt, as though he weren't just watching me, but judging me. At first, I told myself it was just an illusion, the classic effect of portraiture. But that night, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the sense that those painted eyes were tracking my every movement. Brushing my teeth, folding my clothes, even pulling back the blankets, I felt the weight of his gaze pressing into my back. I turned the painting to face the wall before climbing into bed, telling myself it was silly to let a piece of art unnerve me. Sometime after midnight, I woke with a start. The room was silent, but the air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I froze. The portrait was no longer facing the wall. It was upright again, the painted man's eyes fixed squarely on me. My throat went dry. I sat up slowly, every instinct telling me not to move too quickly. My mind scrambled for explanations. Housekeeping must have fixed it earlier. I must have imagined turning it, but deep down I knew I hadn't. I tried to calm myself, sliding out of bed to cover the painting with a blanket instead. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The man's expression seemed different. His lips, once pressed in a neutral line, now curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile. A cold sweat broke across my skin. The blanket slipped from my shaking hands. I forced myself back into bed, clutching the sheets to my chin, eyes locked on the portrait. I didn't sleep, though at some point I must have drifted into a daze, because I snapped awake again to the sound of something shifting. The blanket I'd dropped earlier now lay neatly folded at the foot of my bed. The portrait had changed again. His smile was wider. His teeth were faintly visible, painted with a detail I swore hadn't been there before. I scrambled for the phone, intending to call the front desk, but when I lifted the receiver, the line was dead, just static, a hissing whisper that seemed to fill the room. Through it, I thought I heard a voice, deep and distorted, chuckling faintly. I slammed the phone down, heart racing, and turned back toward the fireplace. The portrait was empty. The frame remained, but the man was gone. I don't know how long I sat frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. Then I felt it, the undeniable sensation of eyes on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, praying I was wrong. In the mirror above the desk, I saw him. Standing behind me. Smiling wider than ever. I checked out before dawn, leaving the key at the desk without explanation. The clerk didn't even look surprised. She only muttered, "Another one," under her breath, as though she'd expected this all along. I haven't stayed in a historic hotel since. And when I see a portrait now, any portrait, I can't help but wonder if, somewhere, he is still watching me. Story 23, The Child in the Hallway. The hotel was a towering concrete block built in the 1970s, all sharp angles and bland beige interiors. The kind of place corporations used for conferences and weary business travelers used as a stopover. Nothing about it was cozy, just endless hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air, the carpet's pattern in dizzying geometric swirls meant to hide stains, and the low hum of fluorescent lighting that seemed to follow you everywhere. My room was on the 10th floor, tucked halfway down a long corridor that stretched farther than felt natural. It was nearly midnight by the time I returned from dinner. The hall was deserted, the silence so complete that I could hear the faint squeak of my shoes with each step. As I slid the keycard into my door, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A child stood at the far end of the hallway. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She wore a pale nightgown that hung loose around her thin frame, and her dark hair fell in tangled strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, small and still, watching. I blinked hard, convinced I was imagining it. But when I looked again, she was still there. My throat tightened. I opened my door quickly, slipping inside and shutting it with a firm click, telling myself it was none of my business. Maybe a guest's child had wandered out of their room. Maybe she'd gone to fetch ice. But when I peeked through the peephole a minute later, the hallway was empty. I tried to dismiss it and prepared for bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The silence outside was too heavy, too absolute. Hours later, sometime past 2, I woke to the sound of faint footsteps in the hall. Light. Uneven. Like bare feet on carpet. I sat up, every muscle tense. The steps grew louder, stopping directly outside my door. Then came a soft knock. 3 raps, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. The knock came again, followed by a child's voice, high-pitched but strangely hollow. "Can I come in?" The words made my skin crawl. Something about the tone was wrong, too steady, too rehearsed, like a recording played back just slightly off. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stayed silent. The voice repeated, "Can I come in?" This time, it sounded closer, as though the speaker had pressed her lips right against the wood. I couldn't move. Couldn't answer. My hands trembled as I clutched the sheets. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. I forced myself to peer through the peephole again. She was there. Standing directly in front of the door, her face tilted upward, staring at me through the lens. Her eyes were too dark, swallowing the light, her mouth twisted into a smile that stretched too far across her face. I stumbled back, slamming the bathroom door and locking myself inside. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the cold tile floor, listening to the faint scrape of fingernails dragging slowly across the outside of my hotel door. At dawn, when I finally emerged, the hallway was empty once more. But the carpet outside my door bore small, dark stains shaped like footprints, leading down the hall and vanishing into nothing. I checked out immediately. The clerk barely looked up when I handed over my keycard. 10th floor, she asked flatly, as though she already knew. When I nodded, she sighed, sliding the card away. She wanders sometimes. Best not to answer when she knocks. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The sound of that little voice still echoes in my head, asking over and over, "Can I come in?" Story 24, the room service that never came. I had arrived late in the evening, exhausted after a long flight, my head still buzzing with the dull ache of recycled airplane air and jet lag. The hotel was one of those modern, upscale chains that prided itself on efficiency. Sleek lobby furniture, polished chrome accents, a faint citrus scent pumped through the air vents to mask the underlying smell of industrial cleaner. Everything looked perfect on the surface, but there was something strangely sterile about it, as though the place had been designed for appearances rather than comfort. By the time I dropped my bag on the bed, my stomach growled with hunger. Too drained to go out, I picked up the room service menu and called down for a simple meal, a sandwich and a glass of orange juice. The clerk on the other end spoke in a flat, almost mechanical tone, but confirmed the order quickly and told me it would arrive in 20 minutes. I flipped on the TV and waited. The minutes dragged. At exactly the half-hour mark, I heard it, a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps, precise and evenly spaced. Relieved, I hurried over and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. I leaned out, peering both ways. The corridor stretched silent and still, lined with identical doors, the patterned carpet muffling every sound. There was no cart, no tray, no sign of staff. I frowned, unsettled, but told myself someone must have knocked on the wrong door. I shut it again. 10 minutes later, the knock came back. 3 raps. The same rhythm. This time I hesitated. My pulse picked up, thudding against my ribs. Slowly, I opened the door a crack. Once again, the hall was deserted. Only the stale hum of the air conditioning vent met me. A chill worked its way down my spine. I called the front desk. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone knocked on my door twice. Could you check if my room service is on the way?" The pause on the other end stretched uncomfortably long before the clerk replied. "Sir, your order hasn't been prepared yet. The kitchen is still open, but it will be at least another 30 minutes. My hand went cold around the phone. "But, someone just knocked," I stammered. Another silence. Then, in that same flat voice, "Do not open your door if anyone knocks again." The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. Why would the clerk say that? Why the sudden shift in tone? Almost as if on cue, the knock came again. 3 raps. Steady. Demanding. This time, it was louder. I pressed my back against the door, every nerve in my body screaming to stay still. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. I held my breath, sweat breaking across my skin. The metal jiggled, rattled, as though someone on the other side was testing it, twisting it back and forth. I grabbed the latch with both hands, bracing it shut. The rattling grew frantic, shaking the entire door in its frame. And then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Minutes crawled by. Finally, when I gathered the courage to peer through the peephole, I nearly screamed. A face stared back at me. But it wasn't the face of a hotel staff member. It wasn't even fully human. Its features were pale, almost translucent, its eyes too large and too dark, set deep in sockets that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. Its mouth hung open slightly, lips colorless, as though it had been carved onto its face rather than born there. I stumbled back, heart in my throat. The knocking resumed, furious now, pounding, shaking the walls. I pressed myself against the far side of the room, praying the latch held. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. When I dared to check again, the hall was empty. The face was gone. 15 minutes later, there was another knock, softer, normal this time. A staff member stood outside with my tray, apologizing for the delay. His hands trembled slightly as he set the food down, and he refused to meet my eyes. I didn't touch the meal. I didn't sleep. I checked out at dawn. And now, every time I hear a knock at a hotel door, I feel my stomach twist with dread, waiting for 3 slow raps in that same unnatural rhythm. Story 25. The elevator that skipped floors. I had checked into a business hotel in a busy downtown district, the kind of place that catered to traveling executives. Everything about it looked ordinary: polished marble lobby floors, soft lighting, a receptionist who smiled without ever letting the warmth reach her eyes. It was efficient, clean, and forgettable. But there was something I would never forget: the elevator ride. I was on the 9th floor, in a corner room overlooking the city. Late one night, after working far longer than I should have, I decided to head downstairs to grab a snack from the 24-hour cafe in the lobby. The hall was eerily silent, as though the entire floor had been emptied out. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the carpet as I made my way to the elevator. The doors opened the instant I pressed the button, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside and pressed L for the lobby. The doors closed smoothly. The elevator began its descent. The numbers above the door glowed softly: 8, 7, 6. And then it skipped. Instead of 5 lighting up, the panel flickered strangely, and the number jumped to 4. I frowned, staring up at the display. Maybe the elevator was programmed differently. Maybe it didn't stop at every floor. But my chest tightened with unease as it continued: 3, 2, B. Basement. I hadn't pressed basement. The elevator shuddered as it came to a stop. The doors slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing a hallway that looked nothing like the rest of the hotel. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven. The walls were unfinished, lined with exposed pipes dripping condensation. A single flickering bulb buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow light. I didn't step out. My instinct screamed not to. But before I could hit the door close button, something moved in the shadows. At the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the low ceiling. Its body seemed bent in unnatural angles, joints too sharp, limbs too long. It didn't walk so much as lurch forward, each step echoing heavily against the concrete. And then I realized with horror, it wasn't moving toward me. It was gliding. Its feet didn't touch the ground. My hand slammed against the door close button again and again. The mechanism groaned, but the doors weren't shutting fast enough. The figure was closer now, its face still shrouded in shadow. I could hear it breathing, a wet, rasping sound like air being sucked through water. At the last possible moment, the doors sealed. The elevator jolted violently upward. My chest heaved, my whole body trembling as the numbers began to climb again: 1, 2, 3, 4. It skipped 5 again. Straight to 6. When the doors finally opened on the 9th floor, I stumbled out, gasping for air. My snack forgotten, I sprinted back to my room and locked the door. The next morning, I asked the receptionist if there was a basement level. She blinked at me, her expression flat. "No," she said. "This building doesn't have a basement." I never used the elevator again. I checked out that evening. And sometimes, when I find myself in a hotel elevator, I catch myself staring at the panel, praying the numbers don't skip, praying the doors don't open to a place that isn't supposed to exist. Story 26. The phone in the room. I had been traveling for work, bouncing from one hotel to another across the country. Most of them blended together after a while: identical beige walls, patterned carpets, sterile artwork, and the faint smell of disinfectant. But one night, in a mid-sized city I barely remember the name of, I was given a room that I will never forget. It was on the 11th floor, tucked at the far end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The carpet there was frayed, the wallpaper peeling just slightly at the edges, as if that corner of the building didn't get the same care as the rest. When I slid my key card into the lock, the door stuck before swinging open reluctantly, groaning on its hinges like it hadn't been used in a while. The room looked ordinary enough: a queen-sized bed, a dresser with a flat-screen TV bolted on top, heavy curtains drawn across the window. But my eyes immediately went to the desk in the corner. There was a phone sitting on it. That in itself wasn't unusual. Every hotel has a phone. But this one was old, much older than the room around it. Instead of a sleek digital handset, it was rotary, the kind you'd see in black and white films, its cord twisted and frayed with age. The plastic had yellowed, and a faint crack ran across the base. It looked wildly out of place in a chain hotel that otherwise prided itself on being modern. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe it was a design choice, a retro touch. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt, like it had been waiting there before the hotel was ever built, like it belonged to someone else entirely. That night, I fell asleep faster than I expected. Jet lag had hit me hard. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. The shrill, metallic trill cut through the silence, loud and jarring. My heart raced as I sat up, blinking into the dark. The red light on the phone blinked with each ring. For reasons I can't explain, I answered it. The moment I lifted the receiver, the ringing stopped. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard it, a whisper. Faint, distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "Don't look outside." That was all. The line went dead. My stomach twisted. Slowly, against every instinct, I turned my head toward the curtains. For a moment, I considered ignoring the warning, pulling them back just to prove to myself that it was nothing. But then, I saw it. A shadow. It stretched long and thin across the fabric, moving ever so slightly, as if someone, or something, was standing directly outside the window. But I was on the 11th floor. There was no balcony. No ledge. No way anyone could be there. I froze, clutching the phone in my hand. My ears strained, and I realized the whisper hadn't stopped. It was still there, faint, leaking through the receiver. Except now, it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Dozens of whispers overlapping, layered and tangled together, none clear, all speaking at once. Words I couldn't make out, tones rising and falling like a storm of voices funneling directly into my ear. The phone grew hot against my skin. The whispers grew louder, sharper, until one voice cut through the noise with chilling clarity. "Don't hang up." I dropped the phone immediately. It clattered against the desk, the cord swinging wildly. The whispers didn't stop. They spilled from the receiver, louder now, filling the room. The shadow on the curtain began to grow taller. Wider. Pressing closer against the thin fabric, as if whatever was outside was trying to force its way in. I grabbed my bag and fled, barefoot, heart pounding as I tore down the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was in the lobby, gasping, clutching my chest. The night clerk looked up at me with a strangely calm expression, as though he had seen this before. His eyes flicked once toward the elevator, then back to me. He didn't ask any questions. I checked out immediately, without even going back for my things. But sometimes, late at night when my phone rings unexpectedly, I swear I can hear it, the faint hiss of many voices whispering all at once, waiting for me to answer. Story 27, The Room That Checked Itself Out. I was on a cross-country trip, driving long stretches of highway until my eyes burned and the lines on the road blurred together. By the time I reached a small town in the Midwest, my body was aching for rest. The only hotel available was an older, 3-story building, its neon sign buzzing faintly, half the letters burned out so it simply read HOEL. The lobby smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals, with dusty plants drooping in the corners. The clerk barely looked up when I checked in, his face pale, eyes sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. His voice was flat when he gave me my room number, 215. I hauled my bag up the creaking staircase, the carpet threadbare under my shoes, and made my way down a dim hallway where the lights flickered every so often. My room was halfway down, the brass numbers on the door dull with tarnish. When I pushed it open, I froze. The bed was perfectly made, corners tucked tight, but there was a faint indentation in the middle of the mattress, like someone had been lying there just moments before. The air was warm, too warm, as though another body had recently occupied the space. The smell hit me next, a faint mixture of old cologne and cigarette smoke, stale but lingering, clinging to the curtains and seeping from the carpet fibers. I shrugged it off as paranoia and exhaustion, dropped my bag, and collapsed on the bed. The springs creaked under my weight. My eyelids grew heavy, but just as I began to drift, I heard a sound. The unmistakable sound of a zipper. Slow, deliberate, the teeth grinding as though someone were opening a suitcase. My eyes snapped open. My bag sat by the door, untouched. But the sound continued. It was coming from the closet. My throat went dry as I slid off the bed, each step cautious, my feet brushing against the rough carpet. I reached out and yanked the closet door open. Nothing. Just a single wooden hanger swaying slightly, as though recently disturbed. I tried to laugh it off, but when I turned back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My bag. It was zipped open. I knew I hadn't touched it. Every item inside, shirts, socks, toiletries, was neatly folded and stacked on the floor beside it, as though someone had been carefully unpacking my belongings while I lay on the bed. My heart thudded so loud it seemed to fill the silence. I stuffed everything back inside quickly, zipped it shut, and shoved the bag onto the dresser. I told myself I'd just leave in the morning. No big deal. But when I finally fell asleep, it was restless, shallow. At 2:47 a.m., the phone rang. I jolted upright, fumbling for the receiver. Front desk, the clerk's voice droned. You need to leave the room. My skin prickled. What? Why? Because the room already checked itself out, he said flatly. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat frozen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, when I heard it, rustling. The sound of fabric sliding across the bed. Except I wasn't moving. Slowly, my eyes adjusted, and I saw it, the sheets depressed slightly, right beside me, as though someone invisible had just lain down. The indentation deepened. I felt the mattress shift, springs groaning under a weight I couldn't see. The smell of cologne grew stronger, thick enough to sting the back of my throat. I didn't grab my things this time. I bolted, barefoot, racing down the hallway and out into the night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine roaring, hands trembling against the wheel. When I looked back, the hotel loomed in the darkness, every window unlit except one. Room 215. The curtains were drawn, but I swear I saw the faint outline of a figure standing there, watching me drive away.